You know, folks, the first few moments of a video game can tell you an awful lot about it.
I live again.
In this case, it tells you the game's gonna be f***ing awesome. Welcome to my review of Blood, an absolute classic first-person shooter for DOS. This was the very first release by a studio you may have heard of called Monolith Productions. They also, of course, released the sequel, but they made a game called Shogo Mobile Armor Division, and later became more well-known for No One Lives Forever and No One Lives Forever 2, as well as Fear. And that legacy began when they released this particular game in 1997 for DOS exclusively. And it was pretty much the final hurrah for the build engine, because this was 1997 and we had the release of Quake 2 later on in that year, and of course the release of the original Quake in the previous year, which ultimately meant that the 2.5D FPS was on its way out. But that didn't stop Blood from getting very good reviews on its launch, and eventually becoming known as one of the big three build engine games, the other two being, of course, Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior. Of course, Blood wasn't quite as popular as those other two games in the lineup, and didn't sell anywhere near as well as they did, leading to it becoming something of a cult hit back in its day, although it did become more popular later on. And unfortunately, you see that a fair bit, a game that is generally well praised when it comes out, but just kind of fades into the background because other games steal the spotlight. Well, Blood has the spotlight right now, so let's go ahead and delve right into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here. Well, as far as presentation goes, like I said, this runs on the build engine, which means that it is almost exclusively 2D sprites, although this one actually does contain the voxel technology that 3D Realms developed for later versions of the engine, and which they also included in Shadow Warrior. Now, in this particular case, the voxels are used for weapon pickups as well as armor pickups, and certain objects in the environment, but not all of them. The vast majority of the game is still going to be 2D sprites as well as 2D textures. And all of that is generally very well done. They've got a lot of detail packed into those textures, they've got quite a lot of detail packed into the sprites too, and it really does help the thing come alive with this very nice horror atmosphere that they've gone for. And of course, that horror atmosphere wouldn't be complete without numerous references to horror movies and also works of literature like H.P. Lovecraft or Edgar Allan Poe. In fact, it's harder to find a gameplay clip that doesn't have one of these references than ones that do have them. But here's a very small selection of them, just so you have some idea of what I'm talking about here.
Nevermore. You're going to need a bigger boat.
Now, of course, those references also bring up the sound design, which I will get to in a moment, because I'll have one last thing to mention about the visuals here. This game's gory as hell, and it's incredibly silly about it. I mean, you've seen plenty of it throughout the footage here, where I've hit an enemy with a particularly powerful attack, and they've just burst into a shower of blood and guts, and it's just ridiculous. It really does go a long way to making the gunplay in this game ridiculously satisfying, and that also brings me over to the sound design, because while the references are a good starting point for where we talk about the sound, what really gets you going throughout the entire game are the actual sound effects, which is mostly rooted in how much carnage you're causing at any given moment. Now, I think it's worth noting that even though this game does generally have rather solid sound effects, none of them are particularly amazing, at least not until you get all of them going together at once. As you can see, it's not just that they have pretty solid sound effects for the era. I mean, you do have to keep in mind this was released in 1997. They didn't exactly have the best sound quality back then. But even then, what they had was pretty good. It's just that when you bring it all together, you end up with this symphony of carnage that just fits the game to a T. This is a game about a psychotic Wild West gunslinger going on a rampage against an evil cult led by a dark god. By its very nature, it pretty much begs for absolute chaos in the sound design, and that is exactly what they did. But then you move over into the music and the voice acting and things get a bit more interesting, because the music is generally rather moody and often very grim. And at least on my end, it's also ridiculously loud, meaning that certain levels were almost unbearable because the music was just so loud it was actually giving me a headache. Now, it's worth noting that I even put the music volume all the way down to 0 in the options menu, and it did absolutely nothing, so I'm not sure if it was just a weird glitch with my particular installation or not, because most other people don't seem to have this problem, so your mileage may vary on that. But even with the volume problem, the music is not something I would consider to be amazing, just very fitting for what they were trying to go for here. But then there's the voice acting, and the voice acting in this game is ridiculously corny, and obviously the actors had a lot of fun with it. I mean, the protagonist, Caleb, just throws around one-liners all the time. He'll start singing show tunes out of nowhere.
Everybody loves somebody sometime. Not me, baby.
When you blast enemies apart, he'll start laughing maniacally. He's just all kinds of fun. You'll encounter demons that have a really cheesy voice that was obviously put through about 20 different layers of audio manipulation before they decided it sounded demonic enough. Then there's a bunch of crazy cultists running around screaming in a made-up language, and they just sound goofy too. And all of that put together just gives the game a hell of a lot of charm. But all that said, as strong as the visuals are and as strong as the audio is, there is one thing about the presentation that is absolutely terrible. The cutscenes, which are that really, really terrible 3D animation from the mid-90s. And I'll be perfectly honest with you, there are only two reasons that I saved the cutscenes until now. First, I wanted to establish how good the rest of the presentation is and how terrible these are by comparison, and second, they're barely even in the game at all. You basically get one at the very beginning of the game, one at the very end of the game, and then a couple scattered throughout the rest of the episodes. None of them are very long either, so it's not like you're getting a hell of a lot of story here, because most of the game is just spent going from point A to point B in the level and massacring every single enemy in your path. So if anything, the cutscenes really are only a detriment to the game, and you might as well just skip them all. But of course, what really matter here are the story, or mostly lack thereof, and the gameplay. Now the story in this is fairly non-existent throughout the vast majority of the game, but you do occasionally get a cutscene here or there that gives you something resembling storyline, and there is a readme file that's available in the game files that will actually tell you what the backstory is. Here's the short version. You play as a guy named Caleb, who was a gunslinger in the Wild West until he met a woman named Ophelia, who introduced him to the dread cult of Chernobog, also known as the Cabal. In time, both he and Ophelia would eventually become members of the Chosen, a group of elite servants of this ancient evil god, who eventually gathers all of the Chosen together in the Hall of Epiphany and says, "Okay, you've all failed me now," and he instantly kills them all. All the while, of course, everybody there is just like, wait, why? What did we do? How did we fail you? Only they're never given an answer. The next thing Caleb knows, he's waking up in a crypt and has only one thing on his mind: revenge. And that's where the game begins, and you basically cut a bloody swath through the entirety of the Cabal until you finally face down the dread god Chernobog himself. But the thing is, that's really just a setup. That's not really a storyline, because the game doesn't really have much of a storyline. It has these handful of cutscenes scattered throughout that barely give you anything to go on. And if you're like me, then you were skipping the cutscenes anyway because they're so poorly animated, so you barely get any story at all. This is because the game doesn't really do much storytelling while you're actually going through the missions. Instead, it's just going from level to level, wiping out any enemy that gets in your path, and getting to the end of the level. The game's split into 4 episodes, although if you have the expansion packs, which are Cryptic Passage and the Plasma Pack, then you get 2 additional episodes, which don't really add anything with regards to story, just more levels for you to mess around with. Thus, it ends up being like most 90s first-person shooters, which is that it's focused almost entirely on gameplay, and story, if there even is any, takes a massive backseat. And the gameplay is where this thing absolutely shines, because if you boot this thing up, then you find out that you're playing one of the finest first-person shooters of the entirety of the 90s. And in some ways, it's actually even better than Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior. And if you guys have watched my channel for a long time, you know that Duke Nukem 3D is my favorite first-person shooter of all time. So I wouldn't say something like that lightly. But of course, then the question becomes, well, what makes it so good? Well, let's start with the shooting mechanics. Every single weapon in this game has a secondary fire. Immediately, everything has more utility than what you would get in Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior. Now, the secondary fire can be something that you would kind of expect, like the sawed-off shotgun firing both barrels instead of a single barrel. Okay, that makes sense. But then you have things like the napalm launcher, where the primary fire shoots out basically a rocket, and the secondary fire lobs a grenade. Or my personal favorite, the flare gun, which shoots out a single flare with the primary fire, or if you use the secondary fire, it shoots out an exploding flare that actually spreads out over time. Now that said, the secondary fire on the Tommy gun is pretty underwhelming because all it does is sweep from side to side, which is really not all that useful because with the Tommy gun you need to focus fire on things. But with the exception of that, all of the other secondary fires have their uses, except for in the case of the pitchfork, which doesn't have a secondary fire. But I mean, it's a pitchfork, what do you expect? Regardless, you will be using your wide arsenal of weaponry and their secondary fires in order to absolutely eviscerate every single enemy you come across. Said arsenal ranges from the relatively conventional like the Tommy guns or the sawed-off shotguns, to the somewhat odd and interesting like the napalm launcher, to the straight-up mystical like the voodoo doll or the life leech scepter. Although your go-tos are going to be the Tommy gun and the sawed-off shotgun just because they're so good at a wide variety of situations, while other ones are a bit more situational. You don't want to be hurling dynamite around in a very enclosed space, for example. It's probably not the best of ideas. And in addition to, of course, being able to blast the enemies apart in numerous ways with your conventional weaponry, you also have the flame weapons, which will set enemies on fire, after which they will start running towards you while on fire and screaming in agony. Needless to say, the effect on target of some of these weapons is absolutely devastating, and that's why it makes them so fun to use. You get so much fantastic visual and auditory feedback on the weapon use that it doesn't really matter if you're fighting a bullet sponge or not. Certain monsters are definitely bullet sponges, but you can tell which ones are going to be such right from the get-go, and you know to expect it. And in those cases, usually those enemies do a lot of damage too, so it makes sense that they would be able to take a lot of damage if they can dish out a lot of damage. Here's the thing though, you're going to be prioritizing certain targets because you can dodge projectiles in this game, and it's really not that hard as long as you know what you're doing. What you can't dodge are the hit scan enemies, which are the cultists with shotguns and Tommy guns. Needless to say, those can be pretty irritating, but as long as you focus fire on them first and take them out first, you can deal with pretty much anything else without too much difficulty. Well, as long as you don't do something stupid like take yourself out with your own splash damage, that gets pretty annoying. But regardless, each of the enemy types does have its own specific attack patterns that you're going to need to deal with, and while some of them do have hit scan weapons, most of them have projectile weapons or are melee enemies. Or in some cases, they spit fire from relatively close range, and that does damage over time. You can still sort of dodge that, but you have to be a lot more careful with how you maneuver around those particular enemies because they tend to follow you. There's also certain enemy types that actually require different tactics entirely, like for example the spirits that will attack you that are looking like the Grim Reaper, where you have to wait for them to become solid before you can actually do damage to them. Otherwise, as long as they're transparent, you can't do any damage to them at all. So in those instances, you kind of have to lure them into making themselves solid right before they attack you, then you have to dodge out of their way and then do damage to them until eventually you manage to take them out. It's that sort of variety that makes the enemies in this game interesting to fight, because you're not just fighting your basic cultists, you're not just fighting enemies that have projectiles from a distance, you're not just fighting enemies with hit scan or melee attacks, you're fighting enemies that actually require some different tactics to beat sometimes. Now, unfortunately, there's not a huge amount of variety in that, but there is some, and that actually really does help things out in the long run. That said, the boss fights are fairly disappointing because they're basically just enemies with ridiculously large health pools and that can do ridiculous amounts of damage to you. Beyond that, the only interesting gimmick, so to speak, for any of the bosses is on the Spider Queen boss, because every time you do damage to it, it ends up spawning a random, smaller spider type, which of course gets pretty annoying after a while. But beyond that, they're pretty straightforward boss fights. And then of course there's the certain enemies that really get on your nerves, like the gargoyles, which fly. Now, flying gargoyles is not that big of a deal, until you realize that you can't aim high enough to hit them. Whenever they start flying, they immediately go to the maximum height of the area that they can get to, and that's always above where your aiming will allow you to aim. That gets really frustrating really quickly, although luckily while they're flying they can't really do much to you. So in that instance, the strategy basically becomes wait until they land and then just blast them with whatever you've got. They're not particularly difficult enemies, it's just that they're frustrating to deal with because they can fly. Well, that, and whenever they fly they move very, very quickly, which makes them a lot harder to hit. But beyond the gargoyles, there's really not all that many enemies that are going to give you too much trouble as long as you're careful and you actually learn which ones you need to prioritize and which ones can wait until later. This becomes especially important when you play on a higher difficulty setting because then the game is throwing a lot of enemies at you at once and you barely have enough resources to deal with them. So for people who are newer to the game, I would recommend the highest difficulty you play it on is Lightly Broiled, which is the medium difficulty, because then it throws a good amount of enemies at you, but it doesn't completely overwhelm you like the higher difficulties do. It still punishes your mistakes very heavily, but it doesn't punish them so heavily that there's no way you can recover from them. On the higher difficulty settings, you really need to be careful, because any mistake is punished extremely severely. But the thing is, it never really feels unfair unless you're playing on the highest difficulty, which is pretty much what you would expect if you've played any 90s first-person shooter. The highest difficulty is supposed to be pretty much unfair. But the second highest difficulty in Blood still feels relatively fair. It feels like as long as you're really careful and you manage your resources well, you can come out on top of just about any gunfight. Of course, to hit that level, you do have to be better at the game than I am, which shouldn't be too much of a task if you set your mind to it. Although a lot of the problems that I run into are simply due to the fact that I'm running this in DOSBox, and the mouse controls in DOSBox for all of the Build Engine games feels really weird. It's actually kind of hard to describe, but occasionally the mouse just kind of hangs up and doesn't really turn the way you want it to turn, and sometimes it turns too far or too short, and even though you feel like you are doing the same motions all the time, it still interprets them differently. Strangely enough, your skills with Duke 3D and Shadow Warrior really don't translate all that well to Blood, because Blood is a bit more advanced of a game, and on top of it being a bit more advanced as far as the mechanics go, it's made to be more difficult. So that's something to keep in mind if you're coming into this game from the previous Build Engine games and thinking, oh, well, it's just going to be a piece of cake. Not really. So on top of the difficulty being higher than the previous Build Engine games and the combat being a bit more advanced, what else is there with regards to Blood? Well, it does still have extremely strong level design with a lot of detail packed into everything. It's kind of a mixture of real-world locations with a lot of fantastical elements, as well as things that look right at home in just about any horror movie you could possibly imagine. In fact, there are entire levels that are complete homages to horror movies. Like, for example, there's one level that takes place in a frozen hedge maze, and there's even a reference to The Shining in it. But I think my personal favorite level is the Dark Carnival, which has fully functioning carnival games in it, which is just astounding that they would go to that much effort to put in that much detail. But then, like Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow, where you have a lot of intricacies in the way you navigate the levels, it leads you around in a rather surprisingly intuitive way, and then on top of that, you have a lot of secrets that you can discover that require full knowledge of how the navigation in the build engine works. And that keeps the game a bit more fresh than you would expect, because it is a very linear game. There are 4 episodes, each of about 8 levels apiece, and once you've played through all of those, the only thing left in the game is the multiplayer component, which is a pain in the ass to get working these days because it was never really made for internet play. It was only made for modem, serial, or LAN. But of course, that's the norm with the build engine, and that's the norm for most of the 90s, really. So those secrets really do help things out, because you can go back through the game again and find new secrets and go, oh, well, that's new, and that makes everything feel a bit more fresh and exciting. Of course, that just makes it a bit more fresh and exciting, because the reason you're really going back to it is because the core gameplay is just so ridiculously good, and the level design is so ridiculously good. Of course, you may also be going back for one of the 2 expansion pack episodes, which are Cryptic Passage and Post-Mortem, the latter being part of the Plasma Pack. Now, it is worth noting that when you actually play the expansion packs, you do notice that there is a pretty big difference between the way that they're made. This is because while the Plasma Pack was made by Monolith, the Cryptic Passage expansion was made by Sunstorm Interactive. You may know them for other build engine add-ons like the Wanton Destruction add-on for Shadow Warrior, or of course Duke Caribbean Life's a Beach. Now, of course, that's not to say that the Cryptic Passage add-on is bad. It's actually pretty decent. They've done a rather good job of keeping with the general style of Blood. It's just that it's not quite as good as the Plasma Pack add-on, because Monolith really understood how to make levels for Blood, and that really does show when you play the Cryptic Passage add-on right next to the Post-Mortem levels. Because the post-mortem levels feel like a fairly natural extension of what you were doing in the base levels for Blood, whereas Cryptic Passage feels like a well-made, but ultimately fan-made add-on. But the real point there is that both of the expansions add some pretty good levels to the game and actually do help things out quite a bit when it comes to longevity. So when you bring everything together, you have level design that kind of snakes in and around itself a lot and also has a lot of secrets for you to discover. You have combat that is extremely satisfying in no small part due to the fact that the arsenal is satisfying, as well as the enemies keeping you on your toes all the time. And you have the combat actually being a bit more advanced than both of the other main build engine games, those being Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior, because you have elements like the secondary fires as well as the power-ups like Guns Akimbo, where you hold 2 guns at once, which increases the satisfaction factor of the combat even more than it already is. And you even have a couple of expansion packs that actually add to the game rather than just being more content without really much soul to it. So of course, with all that praise, that brings up the question of, well, what about the negatives? Well, some of the enemy types are a bit annoying to deal with, namely the gargoyles, being how they don't really work very well with the limits of the build engine. You have those absolutely terrible 3D animated cutscenes that are just cringe-inducing. And you have multiplayer that is an absolute pain in the ass to get working properly because you have to go with a bunch of workarounds in order to actually get things working for you. But then of course there is the one element that is both a problem and actually a good thing, which is the difficulty. I mentioned it before, but I reiterate, this game is difficult. Even for a build engine game, it is difficult. And it ends up being a lot less accessible than both Duke 3D and Shadow Warrior as a result. That's not to say that those games are a cakewalk or anything, they certainly are challenging, it's just that they're not quite as often overwhelmingly difficult as Blood can get. And because it is more difficult and much less accessible than both of those other games, it's also harder to recommend unless you're already a fan of old-school first-person shooters. And that's the ultimate conclusion that I come to with this. If you're a fan of old-school first-person shooters, and especially if you're a fan of the other build engine games, Duke 3D and Shadow Warrior, then you absolutely must own a copy of Blood, because you will almost certainly love it. If you are not a fan of old-school first-person shooters, or if you're not really accustomed to how they play, then I would recommend going with one of the other build engine games first, getting used to how that plays, and then maybe trying out Blood. Because Blood is still an absolutely fantastic first-person shooter, and it's an absolute classic. But if you jump directly into Blood without having played either of the other major build engine games, then you're going to find that it can often be punishingly difficult to you. It's definitely not a particularly accessible game. It requires quite a bit of patience to get through, but if you persevere and you go through it, you're going to find that Blood is one of the finest first-person shooters ever made, despite its problems. And for those of you who are interested in picking it up, I will have a link in the video description box where you can pick this up on both GOG or Steam. Although personally, I would recommend the GOG version because DOSBox and Steam don't really play well together. Just remember that it was not made for a general audience. You really do have to be a fan of old-school first-person shooters to really get the most out of it. Thanks for watching.